Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Charles Chin Yidan, Vice Chancellor and Master. It has been a pleasure for me to be here. I feel like I must begin every talk that I give that is in any way related to the Yidan Prize by just emphasizing the incredible vision of Charles Chin Yidan in deciding to recognize education for the important thing that it is, the engine of upward mobility for people throughout the world and the route to greater prosperity and greater equality and greater happiness in our future. So, Charles Chin Yidan, thank you for that. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work, but I'm not going to use this forum as an example as a place to expound about just my own work. I want to talk about a somewhat smaller vision than Charles's that I have for the future of education research in not only my country but the world. And now I'm going to figure out if I can make this little device work. Good. I believe that we're at the beginning of a period of dramatic change in education worldwide. I think that change is going to be driven by a significant expansion of scientific research in education. This is going to be a worldwide phenomenon, I believe. And I think that this change is going to involve the discovery that education is too important not to apply the best scientific methods that are available to do research in education. I think that this is going to happen not because of the moral imperative, although that should be enough, but rather because it's in every nation's national interest to provide the best possible education for its citizens, and that scientific research has the best prospects of making that possible. I think the process has already started. And some features of the transformation, I believe, are already becoming clear. First, let me say a word about why I think these changes are coming. It isn't just idle speculation on my part. We've known for quite some time that educational attainment of nations has been related to economic outcomes at the national level, economic outcomes like productivity and gross domestic product per capita. I'm going to use, by the way, the words attainment and achievement, slightly different ways of thinking about education. Attainment is the amount of education, and achievement is more about what people actually have learned, as opposed to just how long they've been in school. So we've known for a while that educational attainment has been related to economic outcomes at the country level. And we've begun to discover that educational attainment is also related to economic outcomes at the individual level, that is, earnings. During the last part of the 20th century, the returns to education began accelerating in many countries, particularly the U.S. It was always true that people with more education made more money, but the gap between those who were better educated and less well educated has begun to expand in my country and I think in others as well. Not only that, towards the end of the 20th century, we began to realize that education achievement and cognitive test scores, that is, achievement, not just attainment, were quite strongly related to earnings at the individual level. Other research in personnel psychology began to show pretty definitively that productivity across a very wide range of kinds of jobs is highly related to cognitive test scores. So in other words, it really matters what you know, and it matters more now than it used to. So the lessons from economics, I think, are that nations with better educated populations will be more successful in the global economy. Individuals within any nation who are will be more economically successful if they're better educated. And that these trends depend not just on educational attainment, not just on years of schooling, but on actual measured academic achievement or cognitive skills. And I think these lessons pose challenges, and they pose particular challenges, particularly the second one at the individual level, there's a potential that unequal education can lead to inequality in an economic sense and a social sense, and actually lead to social disruption if the benefits of education aren't shared widely and equally across everyone in society. So I think it's clear that there are reasons to expect that education is going to be more important in the future than it has been in the past. Education research has been around for a long time. There's been systematic education research in my country for at least 100 years and probably longer. It has typically been research done on a small scale with studies involving dozens or hundreds of students and at most a few schools. But during the last part of the 20th century, education research, even though it had a long tradition, had a pretty terrible reputation among scholars. A distinguished historian of education in America once wrote that education had an awful reputation in the research community, and he was actually one of the friends of education research, so you can imagine what the people less sympathetic were saying. It was often true in the last decades of the 20th century that education research used methods that didn't really meet the methodological standards of other social sciences or other sciences outside the social science domain. We knew how to do better and more scientific education research, but there was some of that kind of research going on, but it was uncommon. And it was partly because more rigorous education research was expensive and adequate funding wasn't available, and partly just because it had gone out of fashion. I think education research reached a turning point at about the year 2000. I'm going to talk today most specifically about things that have been happening in the United States, but I see parallels to what's been happening in my country in other countries of the world, particularly in the United Kingdom. I believe that the issues that we're trying to address in the U.S. are issues that are not unique to us, but issues that other countries will have to grapple with as well. And although I'm going to talk about the approaches that we've tried in the U.S., I'm doing this more to illustrate the issues than to advocate the solutions. I don't think the solutions that we've found are necessarily the best. They may not even be adequate, but they give some sense of what the problems are and what some possible ways to approach them might be. So I'll just call your attention to what we know about educational achievement in various countries of the world. International comparative assessments of academic achievement began in the 1960s. Originally, these studies were conducted largely by researchers. They were irregular and not very well funded, and they happened whenever the set of researchers interested in international comparative assessment had the energy and found the necessary funding. First organization to do international comparative assessments of academic achievement, the IEA, began as a consortium of researchers. Because these kinds of studies were often poorly funded, they didn't use the most rigorous methods of survey research or psychometrics. To be honest, to be fair, I think I was involved in some of those studies. I know how difficult it was, and I firmly believe that the folks involved in the IEA did the best they could, and their research was path-breaking. It proved you could do it, even if the research itself wasn't perfect and wasn't the most rigorous it could have been. But this all changed in the year 2000 with the advent of PISA, the Program in International Student Assessment that the OECD put in place. PISA met the highest standards for survey methodology and psychometrics. It had reliable funding for a defined series of assessments over time so that progress could be measured at predictable intervals. PISA has expanded its scope in several ways to become both a resource for research and also a reliable statistical indicator system. PISA has also become, for the countries that participate, a model of high-quality research for national assessment systems. And this is particularly important for the countries that participate in PISA that aren't part of the OECD, the so-called PISA plus countries, that use this assessment as a way of building capacity to do education research in their countries. Now, truth in advertising, I've also been involved in PISA, so you understand that my comments may not be entirely unbiased when I speak of it. Another thing that happened around the beginning of this millennium was in the United States the passage of two important laws that are they're important but somewhat reviled in the education research community. One was called the Education Science Reform Act, which established the Institute of Education Sciences as the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. And the other was the renewal of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was more popularly known as the No Child Left Behind Act. And it's reviled because the law had a variety of features, some of which were both unrealistic and contained actually, I think, pernicious incentives. But it did some other things that I think are quite important, and I'm going to talk about those because they're the often overlooked aspects of the No Child Left Behind Act. I think it's too soon to know whether the Institute of Education Sciences has been a successful innovation. It's only been a couple of decades, but there are at least some indications that it's been successful. It's made some difference. One of those is an evaluation by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which concluded that the IES actually had increased the rigor of education research in America, and they were an unbiased group evaluating whether or not this particular innovation had been successful. So there is at least some indication that there's been an improvement. And here again, I have to note that I am chairman of the U.S. National Education Sciences Board, which is the governing board of the Institute of Education Sciences, so you should evaluate my statements in light of the fact that I have a vested interest in believing that IES is successful. So what's the challenge ahead? Well, I've already said that I believe that bringing the best possible education to everyone is a moral imperative. That should be enough. But governments may see it as an economic imperative as well, and I think that gives me faith that perhaps governments will act. I don't think that merely the fact that we're going to act makes the task easy. In large, diverse countries such as the U.S. or China, the future poses new challenges that are going to require different solutions than the past. In the 20th century, many countries implemented nearly universal education, at the secondary level at least. And that's remarkable progress that really changed those countries, changed the world at least in those countries. And although we might see that as a task completed, I think one of the features that we're beginning to appreciate more in the United States is that although we achieved almost universal secondary education, the very best education was reserved and still in many ways is reserved for elites. Providing the kind of elite education, the best education, to all students poses challenges that we are not entirely prepared to meet, at least at this point. And it's worse than that because the technical communication and cooperation skills that are going to be needed in the future are going to be somewhat different than the ones that are taught today, and the ones that are taught 20 years from now will be different still. When the school curriculum was relatively static, the nature that was in the past, the school curriculum is relatively static, but the nature of relevant skills in the future is going to be dynamic. It's going to change rapidly. We've already begun to see that, and we're going to see it change, I think, even faster. So how is it possible to meet the challenge of providing the very best education to every student? Well, I think there's one clear answer: scientific research and education. We need a new education science. And this new education science, I think, will draw on many disciplines, primarily from the social sciences, but not entirely. And that means that new research skills, new personnel, and new methods will be needed. The scale and funding of research on education inevitably has to increase. Researchers are going to need to develop new relations with schools and with other settings in which education occurs. Increasingly, education isn't just occurring in schools. There's some experience in creating a new education science in the U.S., and I want to tell you a little bit about our experience, and not because I think we have all the answers or even any of the answers, but because they illustrate the things we're trying to cope with. Some people might say, why does education research need to change? And we already have a field of education research. Why all this hue and cry about doing something different? Well, I think the answer is that education research as practiced in the 20th century failed to yield the answers we need. There are many promising ideas that have been developed, but their evaluation was typically so poor that we didn't really learn what worked and what didn't. We often lurched from one innovation to another with great enthusiasm until the enthusiasm faded and people became enthusiastic about something else. Without knowing what worked, change was easy, but knowing if change was actually improvement was much more difficult. And I argue that without knowing what works, it's impossible to consolidate progress and actually be sure that we're moving ahead. In the last 20 years in the US and in the UK, we've conducted hundreds of high-quality evaluations of promising education interventions, products, and services. I'm going to sort of use the term treatment to refer to products, interventions, and services, the sort of bundle of things we might be interested in knowing whether that are supposed to work, and we might be interested in knowing whether they do work. Now, the thing that's important to recognize is that all the treatments that we have considered in the studies we've done had advocates, and they seemed promising, and nobody was trying, perhaps almost nobody was trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They all believed in the products, the treatments that they were advocating. But what we now know is that some of the things that have been evaluated were not better than the practices that they were intended to replace. Some were better, some were worse, and that wasn't obvious before the studies were done. The thing we discovered, I think, is that change wasn't always progress, and that's an important lesson. I'm advocating a big change, so how can you quantify what I'm talking about? How large a change am I talking about? Well, in statistical quality control, we often talk about changes in terms of standard deviations, sigmas. For example, you probably have heard slogans about the 6 sigma changes in reliability in manufacturing. Well, in a similar vein, I'm proposing a 2 sigma change in education. And to quantify that, to put that quantification onto a metric that you might be familiar with, the kind of change I'm talking about is much larger than the difference between the average country in the OECD in educational achievement and the best scoring OECD country in achievement as measured by PISA. That would be more than enough to move the average student from up to the 90th percentile of academic achievement today. It would be enough to move the average school in the U.S. To a very high level of achievement, 90th percentile. So I think a big change of that order is not only feasible, but it's something that we need to set our sights on. Now, it's an obvious question to ask is, can you do this? You know, it's all well and good to propose dramatic goals, but if they're completely unattainable, it seems rather a silly exercise, and it's a waste of all of our time. I would say this. We know today that almost any student can learn almost anything that the best students do today. The problem is most of them don't. And I believe it's possible for most of them to learn almost anything that the best students do today. And the reason I believe that is an analogy to medicine and public health. In the 20th century, medicine and public health experienced dramatic flowering of effectiveness. And, to give you some perspective, at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1890, we knew that people could live healthy and productive lives into their 60s and 70s. There were examples of people who did that, but most people didn't. In my country, the average life expectancy for a white man born in 1890 was 38 years. 100 years later, it was double that. And it was routine for people to live into their late 60s and early 70s, having healthy and productive lives till that time. So in medicine, we accomplished a remarkable change in the health of populations in the 20th century. And when we think about why that was true, it was true precisely because of the advent of scientific medicine. It wasn't that doctors began to care more about their patients. It wasn't that they were more observant. It was medical science that made it possible for that dramatic change in the health of our country to happen and the health of many countries around the world. I think we need to learn from other fields like medicine and create a culture of scientific evidence in education. And I think in order to do that, we need to do three things. One is to create a demand for scientific evidence about education and the will to use it in creating policy and practice decisions. Second thing is we need to create an adequate supply of scientific studies that address how to solve the pressing educational problems we face today. And third, we need to find easy ways, create easy ways for people to find relevant evidence and to distinguish good evidence from bad. This point is particularly important because it has been a problem in many areas of policy. Certainly it's a problem in various aspects of education because there is both good and bad evidence out there, and finding ways it's often difficult to distinguish between better and worse evidence. I want to say a little bit about each of these points to make them, to flesh them out a little bit, because the presentation I've offered is in some sense fairly abstract. So how do you go about creating a demand for evidence? In a certain sense, this is the most difficult of the three challenges. But if we can create a demand for scientific evidence about education, then supply is likely to follow, and there'll be a feedback loop that will ensure that there's an even greater supply and greater usage. I think it's not obvious how to do this. I can tell you that the strategy that's been used in the U.S. has been regulatory. The No Child Left Behind Act prohibited the use of federal funds for any education intervention product or service that wasn't backed by scientific evidence that it was effective. In a sense, this is a remarkable insert to a piece of legislation that mostly had other purposes, but it provided a demand for scientific evidence because those receiving federal funds and wanting to use them were interested in whether or not they could justify that under the law. So the interest in scientific evidence increased somewhat as a result of this regulatory intervention. Now, in the United States, it's important to realize that federal funding is only a small portion of the total funding for education. We have a complex distributed system that makes no sense except historically. But given that system, it means that the federal government and any laws that it may pass are going to have some effect, but their effect is going to be limited because of the scope of federal involvement in education in the U.S. is somewhat limited. But a regulatory approach like this might be more successful in countries that had more centralized education systems. I don't know of an example of it being tried, but it'd be interesting to see it tried. An alternative but indirect strategy is to use incentives for good performance of schools or school systems or education enterprises of various kinds, providing an incentive to use the most effective education strategies. The problem with incentive strategies is that they require good measurement of the performance of schools, and this has proven to be a difficult problem. It's not an area of research that people haven't thought about, but that research has revealed, among other things, that performance measurement schemes can be susceptible to gaming of various kinds of corruption that make performance look better than it really is. I don't think it's impossible to imagine better schemes for evaluating performance, but it's just it's clear that it is a difficult enterprise in its own right. The long-term solution, I think, is that school personnel, policymakers, and parents need to believe that decisions about education should be based on scientific evidence. And it's not outrageous to imagine this could happen. We have gotten used to this in medicine, for example. Okay. Creating a supply of evidence sounds like a good idea, but there are challenges to doing that. We discovered that in the U.S. as we were trying to increase the supply of evidence. One of the things that was true until the 21st century is that most education research was conducted on a small scale, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's essential. Small-scale education research is absolutely crucial. It should continue. In fact, most research probably should be small-scale, but it's not enough. We also need rigorous evaluations of education interventions to make sure that they actually work. The vast majority of evaluations in education haven't used the kind of rigorous, sophisticated methods that are state-of-the-art in medicine or the other social sciences. I think that needs to change. Many education researchers, however, don't have the training to use these kinds of rigorous and sophisticated methods. They were just trained to do other kinds of research. And in fact, it was true in the US, and I suspect it's true in the UK, that many education researchers even oppose the introduction of new methods because it is a challenge to their way of life. Some of the things that we tried was in the US have included, creating a priority for improving education research. And this, I think, is easier than it sounds because the boundaries among various sciences are becoming more porous all the time. That's true in the social sciences. It's also true in the physical sciences and elsewhere. One of the things that has been a strategy that has been somewhat successful in the U.S. is to engage education researchers with other social scientists and begin to sort of merge the skills of other social science disciplines with those of education researchers to tackle important education problems. And this has turned out not to be as hard as you'd think. Education problems are interesting as social science, and scientists are entrepreneurial. They look for interesting problems, they look for important problems, and the way in which you get ahead in the sciences is to find and tackle and solve, ideally, important problems. So we found increasingly people from other disciplines are interested in education and interested in education research. Reliable funding for education research has lured lots of folks from other disciplines into thinking about research on education. It's helped to begin the creation of a multidisciplinary field of education science that has drawn from other disciplines as well as traditional education. But creating this multidisciplinary education science has created new needs. Most scholarly training is discipline-based, and new kinds of interdisciplinary training have been needed. And in the U.S., there have been 3 or 4 strategies that have helped to create this kind of environment where interdisciplinary training can occur. One has been support for universities to invent interdisciplinary graduate programs, not new departments, but programs layered on top of existing departments that are intended to draw people into the study of education. It's also involved support for interdisciplinary postdoctoral training programs that can be, again, layered on top of existing university structures. It's involved novel training for established researchers to learn new methods. I can say, for example, that I've for the last decade, I've run a summer school for established researchers to learn more about conducting rigorous randomized field trials. And finally, there has been the creation of new interdisciplinary professional societies. There's something called the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, which is an example, that was created to support the needs of scholars in the new education science. It's not enough to just create evidence and create a demand for evidence. It's important to be able to help the people who will use the evidence find the evidence they need. And the scientific literature is not always organized in a way that makes it easy for practitioners or even for other scientists to find the research that they need. It doesn't easily reveal that a given intervention may have been studied many times and that those studies may give different results. My own specialty, meta-analysis, concerns how to synthesize findings of many studies that are about the same question, and how to interpret what may seem to be contradictory findings. It's an essential part of developing an evidence base for evidence-based policymaking. And I can assure you that the kind of research synthesis and meta-analysis that is needed is something that requires specialized methods. It's not something that a teacher or a policymaker is likely to want to do or be able to do. And that creates the need for some kinds of intermediaries between the research literature and the consumer of research findings. A relatively new idea that has emerged really in this century, actually, since the year 2000, is the notion of a research clearinghouse, an entity that tries to identify all the research on a given treatment and evaluates that research, synthesizes it together, and makes it easy for those who need that research to see it. There are now well over 30 research clearinghouses that exist in the U.S. Some of them are funded by the government and some are privately funded. One that is funded by the government and pertains to education is the What Works Clearinghouse. It's an Institute of Education Science project, has been around now for 15 years or so. And the What Works Clearinghouse organizes research by treatment, gives a summary of the most rigorous studies, gives an estimate of the effect of the treatment, and synthesizes effects across studies in the cases where there are multiple relevant studies. And it's all available, the results of all this are available on a public website without cost to anyone. And the methods being used are designed to be very transparent. You can find out exactly how what appears on the What Works Clearinghouse website came to be. And of course, if you take issue with any of the ways in which the work has been done, you can both make a suggestion to the clearinghouse to change their methods, but also you have access to the material and you can do your own synthesis. There are other research clearinghouses in the U.S. that focus on different areas. Another example is Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, which is a privately funded clearinghouse that does much the same kind of work that the What Works Clearinghouse does. An important function of clearinghouses is that they provide an evaluation of research. Scientific research is a complicated business, and it's difficult for even sophisticated researchers to determine which studies are likely to be the most reliable. So an important function of clearinghouses is precisely to do the rigorous, in-depth, critical evaluation of claims being made and the research being offered to support those claims. That kind of difficult work is hard for anybody to do, but it's absolutely crucial because we ought to remember that innovations in education are always advanced by people, or almost always advanced by people who really believe in them. They passionately believe that what they're offering is effective. But we should remember that in medicine in the 19th century, the doctors that were advocating the treatments that were popular in the day also believed in those treatments. And we now know that some of those treatments, like hand washing, were effective, and others, like bleeding or the use of mercury salts to treat almost everything, were not very effective. The same, I believe, is true in education, that some of the things being offered as innovations probably work, and some are probably either ineffective or even harmful. And I could probably give some examples. Research clearinghouses have sophisticated staff, and they use transparent procedures for evaluating research and synthesizing it. And so their assessments can be at least relied upon to be relatively unbiased and to provide a good way of distinguishing which research is reliable and therefore what is known about various education interventions. So I ask you to imagine a possible future, a world in which education is more like modern medicine, a world in which there's continuous research to address persistent education problems. And as in medicine, some of those problems will essentially disappear because of the progress of research. Other problems will be lessened by some interventions and maybe lessened again by future interventions. Educators can quickly be alerted to new developments or the reevaluation of evidence about old treatments and that they are relying upon. The education system will make continuous progress towards a world where nearly all students perform as well as the best students do today. To do this, an international effort is going to be needed to make this happen, and I hope that all of us here today will be contributors to that effort and that we'll be successful. Thank you.